Well, good evening. It's good to be with you all tonight. I'm glad we get to spend this time together in the middle of our week. I want you to know that this time of year, it's really, I really need this time in the middle of the week to pause and just remember who our God is together. And I've been extremely encouraged by the worship that we've been able to share in together. You know, as you can tell, my voice gets a little bit shaky this time of year. I start coaching middle school soccer, and it gets a little bit wild, and so I just need a little bit of time to simmer down and come together, remember who our God is, and really just enjoy this time of worship with you. So I'm so thankful that we get to spend this time together. I pray that God has worked in you this week like He has in me by being here, and of course, we also are so thankful for those who are joining us online, and we're glad that you can be here with us tonight in spirit as well. We're so glad that all of you are here present together tonight. I want to start by asking you a question that I'm sure many of you have a quick answer to. Have you ever done the right thing, but still somehow managed to get in trouble for it? Now, I don't mean that you did the right thing and the right thing was telling on yourself, so you went ahead and got in trouble. I mean, have you ever done the right thing, but it wasn't quite the right thing? So I'll give you an example. Like, this happens all the time with my students across the street. They'll finish their work on time, like they do what I ask them to do in class, and when they finish, they'll look up at me and they'll say, "Can I get candy for finishing that assignment?" And I go, "What are you asking me this for? I've never given you candy for finishing your assignment." And yet, I have them ask me questions like this all the time. I am above bribing children, just so everyone in here is aware, at least for now. Like, I haven't reached that point. But they ask me this all the time. They'll say, "Can we play a game if we're quiet in class today?" And I have to tell them, "No, I don't want you to be quiet. Like, you've misunderstood the point of our class. I want you to be engaged, and I want you to learn and to do what you're supposed to do." I can see clearly that they're doing what they think I want for them to do, but they aren't doing it because they want to learn as much as possible or so that they can learn to be the best team player or work with others as best they can. They do it because they think that by doing this, I will give them some kind of a reward, like they can get something else that they want, or maybe something that they think that they can have from me. They think that they will get my stuff, whatever it is that I have to offer them. We'll be continuing tonight in our series in 2 Chronicles that we've been doing together for the last couple months called History Worth Repeating. And tonight we're going to meet a king who is going to do the right thing, but he doesn't seem to always have the best reasons for doing so. Last week, if you were here with us, we learned about King Joash, the boy king. He became king at just the age of 7, and he did right all the years of Jehoiada the priest. Like, as long as Jehoiada was alive, he did right. And Stephen did a great job of showing this to us, showing us how that last part, while Jehoiada was alive, was key to Joash's life. As long as he had good counsel, he did what was right. But as soon as Jehoiada died last week, we talked about how that changed Joash, because he took counsel with men who were not seeking to follow after the Lord. And eventually, this led to his downfall, his betrayal of Jehoiada's family, killing Jehoiada's son, and eventually Joash himself is murdered by his own servants. And tonight we're going to meet Joash's son, Amaziah. And Amaziah has learned from the mistakes of his father, or at least that's what he would have us to believe tonight. So we read about Amaziah in 2 Chronicles chapter 25, so you can go ahead and be turning there if you like. That'll be 2 Chronicles chapter 25 tonight. And I want you to look for an answer to this question tonight as we study about Amaziah together. What is it that drives him? What is it that drives Amaziah? Be on the lookout, and we'll see if we come to similar conclusions, you and I, tonight. So we're going to start reading in verse 1 of chapter 25. It says, Amaziah was 25 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Jehoiadan of Jerusalem. And Amaziah did what was right in the sight of the Lord, yet not with a true heart. As soon as the royal power was firmly in his hand, he killed his servants who had murdered his father, the king, but he did not put their children to death, according to what is written in the law, in the book of Moses, where the Lord commanded, the parents shall not be put to death for the children, or the children be put to death for the parents, but all shall be put to death for their own sins. And I want to stop there and pause with you real quickly here. We're told a couple things about Amaziah right away. One, we are told that he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. That's usually a good sign for the kings that we've studied together in 2 Chronicles. Like, doing what is right in the eyes of the Lord is generally the beginning of a good king. But immediately we learn the second thing about him, and maybe we can't be quite so sure. Yes, we're told he does what is right in the eyes of the Lord, but we're also told that he does not do this with pure motives. Or more specifically, as the text said, he does not do it with a true heart. So I want us to ask ourselves why this may be. What is it that drives Amaziah that is not pure? Why is it that he's able to follow God, but he doesn't have a true heart while doing so? Why would the chronicler write this about him? What has Amaziah seen, maybe, in his life that would cause him to act the way we read about in our text tonight? And I just want to start with those first 4 verses. What is it that Amaziah might have seen in his life that causes him to do this? It's a really peculiar way to start talking about him, especially after it's told us he does what is right, but not with a true heart. So let's look at these verses. It says that the first thing he does whenever he's gotten control of the kingdom is he kills those servants who had murdered his father, the king. And we're told that he did not kill their children because he was trying to follow the law as Moses had given to the children of Israel, where he commanded the parents shall not be put to death for the children shall not be put to death for the parents, but all shall be put to death for their own sins. And I want us to think about just this quick example as we start talking about Amaziah together. Why might he do this? Why might he be so particular about following this law? I would argue tonight that Amaziah has been a beneficiary of this very law. This very law that Moses has commanded the children of Israel to keep. Let's recall what happened with his father Joash. His father Joash killed Jehoiada's son, completely neglected the family that had taken care of him and helped him ascend to the kingdom, the ruler of the kingdom. And that is why we're told that his servants murdered him, to pay vengeance back for what he had done. If you recall, may vengeance come upon you, may I be avenged, are the final words that we heard from Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada. And now, those men who murder Joash seem to be fulfilling that. But they do not kill Amaziah or the rest of the royal line. And so Amaziah is allowed to live. Amaziah himself has benefited from people who decided to take the Lord's vengeance into their own hands and enact judgment. Like, he's benefited from this. And now he rises to power. And he's got to deal with his father's murderers, but he does so the way that God has asked him to do. At least the best that we can. It gets messy in the Chronicles, absolutely, but the best that he sees justice, he tries to enact that, following the law of God as best he can. And why does he do this? Has he seen Joash the way that his father lived? When Joash followed after God, what happened? Good things. Judah was successful. They were able to defeat their enemies. They were able to reestablish themselves. But whenever Joash, Amaziah's father, sinned and left God, what happened? Turmoil, strife, rebellion, assassination. I think that if you saw those two options laid out before you, as Amaziah has, that you might be inclined to choose the way he does here. He chooses that he's going to follow the Lord because he has seen firsthand the power of the Lord and what happens whenever people choose to follow him or not. And so we see that Amaziah is interested in doing what God wants him to do. And for now, he's going to try and follow after God, although we're told his motives are not pure. We haven't seen quite what that means yet, but maybe we get a glimpse into why Amaziah does what he does. And hopefully that'll help us to understand why he does what he does later on in the story as well. So just a few verses later, Amaziah is going to war, and he's going to fight against the kingdom of Edom. In the text, as we read it together, it will also be referred to as the kingdom of Seir, both names for the kingdom of Edom here. And he decides that he doesn't just need his people and his soldiers. He actually wants to hire soldiers from the northern kingdom of Israel as well. And so he hires these extra men as mercenaries to help him fight in the battle against the Edomites. But he receives word from a prophet that warns him to reconsider this decision. So in verse 6, what we see is that he's told, or in verse 7, he's told, "O king, do not let the army of Israel go with you, for the Lord is not with Israel, all these Ephraimites. Rather, go by yourself and act. Be strong in battle, or God will fling you down before the enemy. For God has power to help or to overthrow." So he receives this warning. You need to go to battle. That's fine. But you cannot take those Israelite mercenaries with you. God is not with them. You are stronger on your own than you are going into battle with them. God has the power to both overthrow or to help. It's your choice, Amaziah. What will you do? And Amaziah knows the power of the Lord. He's seen it in his father Joash. But he also has a little bit of a concern here. He's got some extra motivation here for keeping these Israelites around. We see in the very next verse that he says, "But what shall we do about the 100 talents that I have given to the army of Israel?" It all comes back to the money, right? He says, "I've already paid them." And so the man of God answers, "The Lord is able to give you much more than this." And so Amaziah discharged the army that had come to him from Ephraim, letting them go home again. But they became very angry with Judah and returned home in fierce anger. So he's worried about his money. He says, "Look, I've already put 100 talents out there. What am I supposed to do about that, Mr. Prophet?" And he says, "The Lord can give you so much more than 100 measly talents." And that's enough to convince Amaziah that he needs to send those guys home. And they're not very happy about it, but he sends them home anyway. That's going to be important as we go along in our story tonight. So keep in mind, they're not very happy about being sent home before the battle. But Amaziah chooses to do what he's supposed to do. He does what the prophet tells him, but do you see maybe where the problems are starting to bubble up underneath the surface here? Why does he choose to do it? What is it, that question we want to answer, that drives Amaziah? And maybe there's another question we need to ask tonight as well. Does he love the Lord and want to serve him? Or does he love what the Lord can give to him? Does he love God's stuff? So let's continue in our story and see what happens throughout this battle. If you skip down to verse 13, or if you skip down, you'll see that Amaziah is actually victorious. They defeat 10,000 men in the Valley of Salt in verse 11. 10,000 men of Seir, that is Edom. And they actually win. They throw them down so that so they're utterly and completely defeated. But in verse 13, we see that there's a little bit of a catch to their victory. Yes, they're successful in battle. They win exactly like the prophet told them they would. But in verse 13 it says, "The men of the army whom Amaziah sent back," that is, the men from Samaria, from Israel, "they fell on the cities of Judah, from Samaria to Bethhoron. They killed 3,000 people, and they took much loot. So yes, they win the battle, exactly as the prophet told Amaziah they would. Yes, you will win. But that army that was discharged, those mercenaries who were not very happy, they, while the army of Judah is gone, decide that they're going to plunder those cities on their way back up. And so it's kind of a double-edged sword here. And Amaziah is going to react in a way that maybe we wouldn't expect him to this victory. You see, after he came from the slaughter of the Edomites, in verse 14, he brought the gods of the people of Seir, and he set them up as his gods. And he worshiped them, making offerings to him. Now, why is this his reaction? Why does he do this? There are a couple different possibilities. Is it possible that he's angry that his own country has been plundered as he and the army were out to war? Maybe he's frustrated with God. That is certainly a possibility. We have no implication of that in the text, but it's a possibility. From reading scholars and different commentaries, it's not an uncommon practice for someone who conquers a nation to take their gods and worship them. The reason being because it's assumed that the gods of that nation must also be on my side. If they allowed their people to be captured by me and to be defeated by me, well, they must also view me favorably. So I'll just go ahead and thank them for that as well. We see that in the ancient Near East, that's not an uncommon practice. So maybe that's what Amaziah is doing here. But whatever the case, it becomes clear what it is that he cares about, isn't it? However it is that he feels about God or why he might choose to worship these gods, we see his motivation pretty clearly in this, I think. He's willing to serve or worship whatever gods or things or people he believes might benefit him. And God gets angry with this. He sends a prophet to him and he says, "Why have you resorted to a people's gods who could not deliver their own people from your hand?" Which this is more in line with our thinking on it, probably, right? Why would you worship gods that failed to protect their own people? But as he was speaking, the king said to him, "Have we made you a royal counselor? Stop. Why should you be put to death?" And so the prophet stopped, but he said, "I know that God has determined to destroy you because you have done this and have not listened to my advice." Amaziah's true colors come out a little bit here. He cares about following God, sure, as long as that is beneficial to him. But his heart is not really with God. His heart is set on his position as king, on his wealth. We saw that with his 100 talents. On the stuff that he can accrue by serving a god or a person or a thing. And this is going to be his downfall as we read the rest of this chapter together. So Amaziah is going to send word to the king in the north, the king of Israel, who in a very confusing turn of events just happens to be named Joash at this time, which is also the name of his father, of Amaziah's father. So understand, we're not talking about his father. His father has been murdered. He's not come back here. We're talking about the king of the north now. He sends a message trying to have a council with him face to face, and he gets this really weird tree analogy back in return about the cedar of Lebanon and the thorn bush of Lebanon and an animal stomping on the thorn bush whenever it asked the tree to let his daughter marry his son. It's a really weird analogy, but basically he says, "I'm not coming out to meet you. Stay home. Stay out of trouble. If you want to pick a fight with me, then it's not going to end very well for you." But Amaziah, we're told in verse 20, would not listen. And why is that? In verse 20, what does it say? It was God's doing in order to hand them over because they had sought the gods of Edom. So Joash, king of Israel, went up. He and King Amaziah of Judah faced one another in battle at Beth Shemesh, which belongs to Judah. And Judah was defeated by Israel. Everyone fled home. And we're told that Joash went all the way to Jerusalem. He broke down the wall of Jerusalem, a distance of about 400 cubits, that he seized all the gold and silver and all the vessels that were found in the house of God. He seized all the treasuries of the king's house, and he also took hostages, and he goes back on his merry way up to the northern kingdom in Samaria. The prophet warned Amaziah, but Amaziah was not really interested in doing what was right in the eyes of the Lord. He was interested in getting anything he could from the Lord, or anyone else that might be able to give him what he wanted. He did not follow God with a true heart. And he's going to be murdered as well. We're told in verse 27, from the time that Amaziah turned away from the Lord, his people made a conspiracy against him in Jerusalem, and he fled to Lachish. But they sent after him to Lachish, and they killed him there, and they brought him back on horses, and he was buried with his ancestors in the city of David. And I just want to stop and ask the question, what went wrong? What was it that caused this? We're told from the beginning that this king was one who did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. So how is it that things could go so poorly and so badly? Even if his heart maybe isn't always right, how is it that you go from serving God to being murdered just like your father was? How did we get here? It's the answer to that question of what drives Amaziah, what drives him that we've talked about tonight. It's his selfishness, his desire to serve not really any God. Rather, he kind of sets himself up as a god. And he's willing to entertain anyone who may help him or dispose of anyone that he sees as useless. Amaziah does what is right in the eyes of the Lord, but his heart is not true because he doesn't view the Lord as God. He sets himself up as his own God. So why is this history worth repeating? What is it that we today, as people of God, take from a passage like this one? What lesson ought we to learn from this story tonight? Is it possible, church, that we too might sometimes love what God has to give us more than we love him? I think this can be a temptation for all of us. And I want us to think about a story that Jesus tells in the New Testament together as we close tonight. Maybe you'll see the connections here as well. In Luke chapter 15, we're told a story about a man who has two sons. One who's older, and as best we can tell is obedient to his father. And the younger one, well, you probably know the story. He's a little bit of trouble. And he asks his father to split the inheritance, and he takes it, and he lives raucously in a faraway land, winds up in the dumps with no money. And he has this revelation, I need to go back home. And he returns, and his father accepts him and throws a huge party for him. All the while, that older son has been serving his father tirelessly. You probably know this story, but in light of what we've talked about tonight, in light of a king who did what was right in the eyes of the Lord but did not do so with a true heart, I want you to hear the words of that older son in the parable that Jesus tells to his followers several centuries later. In Luke chapter 15, starting in verse 25, it says, "The elder son was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, his father's house, he heard the music and the dancing. And so he called one of the servants, and he asked what was going on. And the servant replied, 'You'll never believe it. Your brother has come home, and your father has killed the fatted calf because he has got him back safe and sound. This is a party. You wouldn't believe it.' But the older son became angry, and he refused to go in. His father came out, and he began to plead with him. But he answered his father, 'Listen, for all of these years I have been working like a slave for you, and I have never disobeyed your command. And yet you have never given me even a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours comes back, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you kill the fatted calf for him? I'm not going in there. I want nothing to do with this party." Then the father said to that older son, "Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours." And that is actually true. Like, he's not just speaking metaphorically here. The younger brother's already taken his share. Everything the father has now belongs to this older son. But he tells him we had to celebrate. We had to rejoice because this brother of yours was dead and he's come back to life. He was lost and now he was found. Maybe you hear those words that Amaziah and the prophet exchanged, where Amaziah says to the prophet, "But what about my money? Like, what about my 100 talents that I was going to spend for these mercenaries?" And the prophet said, "The Lord can give you so much more than that." We point to the younger son as being reckless, and we point to the older son as being bitter, but the truth is they're both wrong. Because at different points in the story, they both want their father's stuff more than they want their father and his love and to be in his house. Church, history worth repeating is learning from Amaziah. Because Amaziah wants what God can give him more than he wants to follow and serve the God that loves him. Jesus, in the story of what we call the lost son, points out that this is a problem that plagued God's people in his own life. People who wanted what God could give them more than they wanted to be a part of God's family, whatever that might mean, even if the lost son comes home. And I want to ask us today, what is it that drives us? We may not see ourselves like that younger son in the story. Oftentimes I feel like people in church tend to associate with that older son. So what do we love? Do we love our Heavenly Father? Or do we love the things that He can give us? The things that He could provide for us? I encourage you this week to seek God, not because of what He can give you, but because of what He has already given you. A place at the table. Amaziah couldn't see it. He couldn't see that literally everything he needed was there with God. All he could see was what was before him. The money that he lost, the defeat that his own nation suffered while he was away at war. He couldn't see that God had already given him everything he had. Even the kingdom was his. I ask that this week we would see not what we could gain from God, but what we have already been given by God through Christ. Everything that God has, He has given to us. And all He wants, all He asks for in return, is our love and for us to share that love with others, so that in doing so, His kingdom might spread and His will might be done on earth as it is in heaven. However it is that you need to respond to this message tonight, whether you feel like your heart has been true to God and maybe that's been a challenge. Maybe you're going through difficult times. You're doing what's right in the eyes of the Lord, but it's not paying out for you, kind of like what Amaziah dealt with at times. We're here. We want to be here for you, to strengthen you, to let you know that it's always right to do what is right in the eyes of the Lord. Or maybe tonight you look and you say, I've been following God, but really I haven't been seeking Him. I've been doing what was right, but not for the right reasons. I think we've all been there. And we want to be here for each other tonight in that. God is willing to forgive. He's willing to give you people in your life to help you, to strengthen you in that as well, so that we can all serve Him and follow Him more closely. Whatever it is that you need tonight, however you need to respond to this message, you can do so now while we stand and while we sing.